So hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming to our webinar today. My name is Mariota. I work at MyTutor. I'm the one who makes all the the blogs and ebooks and any other kind of educational resources you tend to see if you get our newsletter. And I'm really excited to introduce Brian Platzer and Abby Freireich who are with us today. So Brian and Abby are educators and authors based in New York City. Abby's in Manhattan and Brian's in Brooklyn today. They're the co-authors of Taking the Stress Out of Homework, Organizational, Content-Specific and Test Prep Strategies to Help Your Children Help Themselves. They're also both teachers, tutors, and they run their own New York tutoring agency where they're constantly supporting other tutors to help their students as well. Today, they've made a special presentation for MyTutor parents and teens, and they'll be sharing their top advice on how teens can grow their independence with their learning, develop home learning tactics to superpower their grades, and also enjoy learning from home as well. And yeah, we've been discussing a lot the kind of current situation with post-COVID and going back to school, so it should be super relevant for you guys. And then if we're ready, I'll hand over to you guys. I think Brian, I think you're going first. First time.
It's such a pleasure being here with you all today, with everybody from MyTutor, as well as students and parents from across, I guess, across Europe looking at the chat. It's very, very exciting for us. We've prepared a presentation on how best to think about organization and preparatory skills. But while we're talking, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I know there's going to be a time at the end that is officially sectioned off for you to ask us any questions about what we've missed or perhaps other topics that we don't cover here. But as we are going over best practices and methodologies, if you have any questions about what we mean, if you have any way to any comment about maybe something that's not directly applicable to you, but comparable to what I'm saying that you want to ask us, or if just any tangents that seem interesting from your perspective. I see that we have a lot of parents here with us today, so all the better. Abby and I will do our best to speak to parents and students simultaneously, but of course, if there's anything specifically parentally oriented or for the perspective of a student, please ask us in the questions in the chat function as well. The more interactive and the more personally tailored to you this is, the better we'll feel about taking your time today and trying to advise best we can. So the way that I'm going to start off is just talking in general about the way many students confront an evening of homework or asynchronous work or schoolwork to be done on one's own, and maybe some better ways to start organizing and planning. In the United States, we talk a lot about executive function skills over the past 5 years or so, which a decade ago just meant organization and planning. But what we like to talk about is executive function skills as a way to try to take control of everything on your plate, every accomplishment, every task that you need to accomplish moving forward, and become more independent and more autonomous in controlling them and feeling like you have mastery over them, as opposed to are overwhelmed by all the tasks in your life. Because a lot of what we see happen in the States and in the UK and across Europe is, especially at this time when we know that there are exams that people are preparing for, as well as nightly tasks, it can be sometimes hard to figure out how to approach those tasks on a basic evening. And what we see is, instead of just as they come to mind, taking off a task, trying to write that essay or prepare for that quiz, if the first thing you do, if you don't have a thorough organizational system, is writing down everything you have by hand, we find that that is a way to have a better control over the work. And even if that can be on a large whiteboard or on a chalkboard or something at home, you can buy them on Amazon. They cost, £10 or whatever it is, but you can unroll them, you can stick them up on a wall, and you can have markers and space to outline not only assignments for that evening, but the variety of assignments. And what we strongly recommend is that you handle or you attack that first and most intimidating assignment first. because a lot of times we talk about list making for our students. And what you have is you have a jumble of assignments in front of you. And what students like to do, what we all like to do, is get rid of the easy stuff first. So we have a list of items, and maybe the most exciting element to tackle for Jada this evening will be, to buy basketball equipment and to email her teacher. She has a list of 7 things she wants to do. The problem is, if she ticks that off a list, if she does the emails and the fun stuff and the Amazon purchases first, then as the evening gets later, as the student gets more tired, more frustrated, the harder assignments, revising for a chemistry test, for example, could become increasingly intimidating. And where you have more energy for that initially, if you do that first thing after dinner, it can become more intimidating, scarier, and it can make the work that you do up until the chemistry test feel more of a distraction than the work itself. So what we strongly recommend is write a list of all the items that you have to accomplish that evening, reorder that list from most intimidating to least intimidating, and then tackle the most intimidating ones first. So that way, when you're tired, when it comes closer to 10 p.m. or 11 or midnight, and you just want to call it an evening, instead of having a antagonistic conversation with your parent or your child or whoever it is that does homework in your house, you have already accomplished those more overwhelming goals, and you have the easier tasks that's left over. You'll see on Jada's homework plan that we have a couple other suggestions that really benefit students, whether they're 9 or 10 years old and beginning to deal with a series of different types of assignments, or all the way through students who would normally be taking the A-levels. If you add in your breaks and the amount of time that you estimate each one of these tasks will take, you can feel more ownership over the tasks and feel more organized along the way. So for example, we assume there are some extracurricular activities built into many of your schedules. Then we see the most difficult item on this list for Jada will be studying for that chemistry test. If Jada estimates that studying for the test will take approximately 45 minutes, it means she won't fall into that trap where she's been preparing, revising for 2 hours or so, and she hasn't yet gotten to the examples for her history essay and her math worksheet, and she won't be to the point where it's time to go to bed, but she hasn't yet accomplished everything that's necessary. So if you have some of these tasks where you can estimate how long they will take, that can help you check where maybe you've gone over the 45 minutes, it's an hour, at least okay, I've done everything I should in terms of allotment for that time, and I can move on. Some students, especially younger ones, like to work with an egg timer, we call them, or I think you call them egg timers also, but some sort of timer where, it counts down and then buzzes, or an alarm system on Amazon Echo or whatever you have in your home to set it up. So you want to make sure that you have time for each one of these items to accomplish by the end of the evening. And building in breaks is important, especially for so many of us who are still online all day, either Zooming through school or rushing between in-person and virtual learning. The idea of just bullying through a nightly homework is very appealing, and you want to prepare for the chemistry test, get rid of that, find the examples from the history textbook, move forward. But if you don't build in breaks, such as taking a shower or watching some silly something on YouTube or on TikTok or checking out a sports score, then the work becomes decreasingly effective, because without those breaks, you don't have the focus that you're moving forward with across the evening. We find that as the work gets more sophisticated and the assignments are more long-term, such as essays that are assigned, one day for a due date, weeks or a month in advance, or studying for, revising for an exam that will come over in a few weeks, breaking down those assignments into smaller chunks and back planning ends up being a way to best take control over these larger assignments so they don't sneak up on you. Because so much of the frustration we see between parents and students is when a larger assignment is due, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, and then it's a day or two before that due date, and a student panics and gets frustrated and says, oh no, this assignment is due. We have students in the past who are, we have seen students all the time who have some scaffolding done by their teachers, who have, maybe they'll say, the teachers will say, we have an outline due Tuesday and then an assignment due Friday. But if students are able to break down these larger assignments into, as opposed to large, monolithic, overwhelming single item tasks, but into 6 or 7 different tasks, each one can then be a lot less intimidating, a lot less frustrating, a lot less taxing, and they can be simple to accomplish. Whereas if you sit down and attempt to write the entire essay at once, you can feel overwhelmed, the work won't be as strong, and you won't have time to revise. Our sense of revision, you won't have time to edit at the end. So for example, in this case, for an essay due in 2 weeks on the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, if you break it up so all you have to do on Monday is reread important sections, that's simple. There's no problem there. And you can move forward just having reviewed some of your favorite or least favorite passages. Tuesday, then the day after, you've already gone through the material. So you've refamiliarized yourself with the book. And now you can start assembling quotations, thinking about an argument or a possible thesis statement, beginning potential analysis for those quotations. You can take a day off on Wednesday. And then when we talk about outlining an essay, so often that can mean just compiling the components that you've already done on Tuesday. You have a general thesis for the essay. You have the evidence, which in this case is quotations from the text. You have the beginnings of analysis of those quotations, and you put those all together in the first draft. You can take a day off from Saturday. You can take a day off after you have written that first draft on Friday. But again, the writing of the first draft doesn't feel overwhelming or too taxing because you've already done the work of rereading, assembling quotations, having an outline. And then the transition from assembling the quotations in the thesis to an outline is going to be relatively similar to the transition between having that outline and filling out the gaps for the first draft. After you have a first draft of an essay, we find it incredibly valuable to not only reread it once it's on the screen, but to print it out and edit it by hand for 2 different foci. So one of which is the logical progression among paragraphs in an essay, and another is going to be for mechanics and grammar and usage and language. Too often we see students making a combination of mistakes that should be avoided at this point. One, they read through their work on the computer, and that becomes far more of a passive experience than an active one, where a lot of you are accustomed to seeing, an essay or a piece of writing that you've written on the screen, and you sort of read through it, and yes, that's what you wrote, and it looks okay. Whereas if you print it out, take a pencil in hand, read out loud what you've written, you'll find all sorts of logical errors where you can say, oh, that sentence doesn't really belong before this one, and that transition doesn't really make sense before this next paragraph topic sentence, as well as you'll find moments where you're pausing in speech where you wouldn't in writing, where you can think about adding a comma or breaking up a sentence into 2 separate sentences. And then by the time you're turning it in on Tuesday, there's no pressure at all because you've already run through it. So those are the 2 basic techniques that if you haven't engaged in, we strongly recommend. The first is ordering assignments and working through them from the most intimidating to the least intimidating. The second will be to back plan assignments. So even if a due date is in the future, you break up that assignment to smaller ones and put those smaller sections of the larger assignment in a calendar. And ideally, what we will have at the end, especially as exams start to approach, is something that looks like this, where if you aren't writing down on that whiteboard or on a blackboard or just by hand your tasks, you don't need to jump into a full weekly or monthly planner. Just writing events and ticking them off as you go is fine. From that point, if you're able to back plan and break down the larger assignments into small ones, that's spectacular. But if you're at the point where at this time of year, you're trying to fight through nightly assignments, weekly assignments, as well as, and Abby will get into this a little bit more in detail, but how to break down studying sessions to make the most out of them for the larger examinations that are coming up. Having a weekly or even monthly planner where all of this information is existing together becomes not only an invaluable resource, but it lets you as students or you as parents see that your students have access to everything at once. So they can't be surprised by, you know, an exam that's going to be on Wednesday without realizing it, or an essay that's creeping up on them. So this way you'll see on Monday, there's still time for basketball. There's always time for basketball. But after dinner here, we've broken up the English essay into, on Monday, that's the most intimidating task. So that's going to be the task that's done right after dinner. A break built in, and then maybe the math problem set. You'll see it's the most intimidating part of the evening on the Monday. It is also on the Tuesday because the student will be drafting body paragraphs. But by the time it's Wednesday, getting references for the paper together might be less intimidating or less stressful than the problem set. But the idea is not only do you put short-term assignments in this type of weekly organizational platform, you put longer-term back-planned assignments in, and also non-academic work. So we have a doctor's appointment on Wednesday, or, you know, Tom is throwing a party on Friday, so we have to make sure there's nothing to be planned for Saturday morning. Maybe you probably don't have baseball mitts to the same quantity as we do, but you're buying your new soccer cleats, football cleats, forgive me, won't do that again, for next week, and that might be built in to the planner as well. So our basic technique, and what we've seen the science and the research really pan out here, is the more control you have over as many days into the future as possible, the better you will do on each individual assessment. And it means also, if you have a planner like this, you'll be able to see perhaps Tuesday is a light day, but on Thursday, not only do you have to revise an essay, but you have to study Spanish vocabulary and annotate history reading. If Tuesday isn't as overwhelming, you can see what's coming ahead on Thursday and perhaps start learning some of that Spanish vocabulary on the Tuesday. So you can build from smaller senses of control over the text and over the responsibilities to larger ways of gaining control by breaking up large assignments to smaller ones, to having a sense, especially during these times of years that you're dealing with now, how the entire week or even month can be in front of you, and work can become something that you control as opposed to something that frequently surprises you. Abby, anything I missed in this general how to start planning when it comes to work?
No, I was just going to say, as parents, this is really the best way that you can support your children with this back planning and looking at what's coming ahead. Because whereas, especially when students are, you know, between the ages of, let's say, 13 and 18, it's much more difficult from a content perspective as a parent to kind of dive in there and know exactly how to support them. This is really in miniature what we as adults do all day, every day in terms of multitasking and trying to figure out how we're going to, you know, keep all these balls going at once and how we're going to accomplish all the tasks that need to be done. So the better we can model this and help our children with it, the more successful they will be and the more autonomous ultimately.
Susanna asks a question, Abby, which is almost unanswerably complicated, but I think that we can begin to try to chip away at it in order to provide some support. So she says, let's say you have exams that in about 2 weeks for 10 different subjects, and each subject has 5 topics. How do you tackle that? And our initial response to that, and then Abby will jump in to backfill what I've missed, but our initial answer will be to spend the time ahead of time really organizing and laying out what those 50 different topics are. And it sounds overwhelming and it sounds insane. And the idea of having 50 topics that you're going to need to master over 2 weeks is scary, but it's not as scary as knowing you have 50 topics out there and trying to one by one attack each one of them with the fear that there's still an amorphous 47 left, you know? So we find that even if we really are talking about 50 separate topics that you will be tested on in 2 weeks, spending an hour or an afternoon or an entire weekend laying it all out visually and having, you know, for some students it's with index cards, and you have index cards for these 10 classes, 5 topics each, and saying, you know, for biology, sort of the units of each organ in the cell, and then mitosis versus meiosis, and then et cetera, seeing them lets you do a few things. It lets you see everything you're going to have to accomplish. 2, it lets you begin to create categories, and Abby's going to get into this later, of material you've mastered versus material that you don't yet know. So that pile of material you don't know can decrease in size, and therefore in an overwhelming feeling, and you can start to allocate where you're going to need to spend most of the time. So although I could feel I could understand the idea of being overwhelmed by seeing these 50 different items, and again, if it's visually on paper or if it's in a Google Doc or however you prefer to do it, having those 50 different folders with 5 topics in each, but having them written down, really understanding what each of them is before you go in and try to take each one off the list, will give you a sense of at least some control over what's to come, as opposed to closing your eyes and just throwing darts, and whatever you hit is what you study next.
Right, absolutely. It's all about back planning and figuring out what you need to do ahead of time, as Brian said. And I would just keep in mind that if you're studying, 5 topics a night or whatever it is, the subjects that are hard, like let's say you're working on mitosis versus meiosis and you're having trouble remembering the differences, what you can then do if you have like a big whiteboard is you can jot down on, let's say you start studying Monday, you can just jot down on Tuesday, remember to look over my pile of flashcards or whatever it is. So if you have, I am a really big proponent of having things not just in folders on a laptop, because the more visual it is for you, the better more easily you'll just be able to add to what you actually need to do. And the better you'll retain the information at the end of the day, both in terms of writing down the information that you need to learn and in terms of seeing it to back plan. And Jem, you asked a great question about how to help him revise. I'm actually going to, Brian, if it's okay, switch gears here to discuss how to study, and as parents, how to help your children study. So the most important thing first is to just think about, as students, how you learn best, and as parents, asking your children how they learn best, or sharing perhaps your observations about how they learn best. So many students need to write down their ideas to internalize them. Some can process material by hearing it in class and they'll be able to recall it, and others understand concepts through interactive and hands-on engagement with materials. And most students and adults benefit from some combination thereof, where you're using many different approaches. But it's important to remember that just because perhaps your friend or your child's friend can remember what happened in class, last week, that may not be true for your child. And that's beneficial in thinking about the best study plan for you. So the first strategy that we recommend, that really builds upon what Brian was saying in terms of back planning, is using what we call a cumulative approach. So breaking down the material, as we just in the previous question we're discussing, and breaking the questions and the information into stages that build upon one another. So what often happens with all students, and I think with all adults as we confront a work project, is that when we have vast swaths of material, as is sometimes the case at the end of the year with major assessments, it can feel really overwhelming and daunting. So the most important thing to do is to break it up into a series of discrete parts based on the number of topics and the number of days that your child, or as a student, that you have to prepare for a test. So let's say that you have a history assessment coming up next week. What you would want to do is break the material up into different sections. So what I often recommend with my own students when I tutor them, if they have a lot of history content to master, we go through and we break it down into sections. So we number the sections. So Monday, for example, they might focus on section 1. Tuesday, they'd focus on section 2. But then, perhaps counterintuitively, you don't just go on to section 3, because you need to take time to revise for the first 2 sections before moving on to the third. Otherwise, what sometimes happens is by the time you get to the third section, you've forgotten entirely what you've learned before. And this is especially true, when kids have trouble retaining information, or as a student, if you think, oh gosh, there's so much to be revising here, this is a really helpful way to break it up. So Monday would be section 1, Tuesday, section 2, Wednesday, you'd revise, and forgive in the States we say review, but it's really revise, sections 1 and 2. And then Thursday, you'd learn section 3. And then Friday, you'd revise all 3 sections. And that really helps to ensure that you've covered all the bases and that you remember equally well what you learned for section 1 as you do what you learned for section 3, because oftentimes kids will remember what it is they've looked at the most recently, but forget what it was that they, looked at several days ago. And this is especially important, I think, to think about and consider this time of year. The next thing that can be really helpful to do is to summarize, and this is especially true, I think, when you've got a history or an English assessment coming up, to summarize using, or science as well, using concise lists and identifying keywords. So oftentimes you'll be confronted with a vast chunk of text and it'll feel really overwhelming and you're not sure quite what to do with it. So what you can do is break down concepts into key phrases and create lists. And that can help to make new information a bit less overwhelming, and have a series of bullet points. One of the other things that can be really helpful is to create mnemonics. And I do this with my students all the time. So a mnemonic device is a way that you can remember information. So, and sometimes the sillier the mnemonic, the better. So for example, in French, there are the Van der Tramp verbs for verbs that use être, or, in music class, if you're learning the notes, it might be every good boy deserves fudge, to remember which is where. And those words can, A, it just makes it more fun, and B, it can be really, really helpful. So for example, you might even think about for the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv. And one thing we're going to be discussing as well too is putting some music to some of the songs. So this can actually be really helpful regardless of the age of the child. I have a kindergartner who's 5, and I work with an 18-year-old, and we use the exact same strategies just for different content. So it could be, if you're trying to remember the colors in the rainbow, it could be Roy G. Biv, or it could be, you make up a funny little tune to it, like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and forgive my singing. But you know what? It works. And that way, it mixes things up and it'll help you retain whatever the information is. Another example is if you are, let's say, learning about a complex issue or trying to remember feudalism, and what was the point of feudalism? What did it do? Instead of writing down or trying to transcribe, 4 or 5 pages from a textbook, what you can do is kind of boil it down to its essential elements. So think about, what did feudalism do? And this would ideally be something that you as a student would write out by hand with good old fashioned pencil and paper, because that's really what's going to help you retain the information best. It helped to create a system of government, a structure of justice, and a means of protection, perhaps. Okay, and let's say you just can't remember what these different components are. What you can do is just think of a fun way to remember it. So giraffes jump poorly. It's a ridiculous thing that's completely nonsensical and has nothing to do with feudalism, but it is so helpful just in terms of thinking of, how am I going to remember this? G for government, J for justice, P for protection. This works brilliantly with kids of all ages. And again, it can be a very sophisticated topic or something that's very straightforward. in terms of helping to remember a lot of information. And obviously jumping giraffes have nothing to do with feudalism, but can come in handy. Another thing to consider when you're studying or revising for an assessment, big or small, is that the visual presentation of information really matters. So again, if you just see a lot of words or a paragraph or pages, your eyes can kind of glaze over it. And what can be really helpful to do is to kind of sort these, what can feel like unsorted papers floating around in a big drawer, to give them all subdivisions and a logical organizational framework. So what you can do is to create charts of information. So for example, if you are learning about European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere, rather than writing down a paragraph of information, thinking about, especially if you've got a lot of explorers, this would just be an example of what you might do for one explorer, and then it could be a larger chart, thinking about the categories. So name of explorer, country of sponsorship, main regions, significant actions. And so what this will allow you to do as a student, or will allow your children to do as parents, is to take a step back and think about what's really essential here. And then how can I get an overview of all the information? Because if you do this for each of the explorers and you write out a chart by hand, and then you either can, as a student, ask your friends to quiz you on it, or your parents, or perhaps, you cover up, you have, okay, no, I'm studying Amerigo Vespucci. You can take an index card or cover with your hand, okay, let's see, what was a country of sponsorship? Right, Spain and Portugal, and then kind of go across in succession to quiz yourself. What you can also do is to really be sure that you've internalize the information, take a piece of paper and actually, assuming it's not transparent, put it directly over, the sections that you're studying, and just practice jotting them down, jotting down the responses, and then see, oh, this is something I need to circle back to, and then you can highlight or put a star next to the information that you need to revise. The other thing that's important to do is to create a narrative to make these facts kind of stick or adhere to, because if you're just memorizing these pieces of information, that they'll kind of float about and they need something to adhere to. So rather than trying to memorize isolated data points, try to link them to their context. So for example, again, if we're discussing the accomplishments of various explorers, you might think about how they affected one another, or was one explorer inspired by another's accomplishments? And then doing that will help you remember, oh, right, I remember that Amerigo Vespucci did such and such, and that influenced this explorer. Or you can also do that across subjects equally well. So for example, if you're thinking about science, photosynthesis relies on cellular respiration because, or if you're reading about medieval times, you might think about, all right, well, how was Sir Lancelot important to the vision of chivalry in the medieval ages? So again, just thinking about how different parts work together is really important in becoming a critical thinker. And it also just makes it more interesting, so it doesn't feel quite as tedious or rote. One of the other things you can do whenever you're reading or you are revising for a test is we always recommend reading with a pencil in hand, or if possible, printing out, double-sided to hopefully save some trees, the text that you're working on in class, especially because all of us, I think, students are so burnt out at this point, and it's harder to really interact with a text when you're looking at a screen versus when you actually have a pencil in hand. You can internalize the material better. It won't give you a headache, all of those things that can be really, really helpful. So if you're reading, for example, and you're having trouble remembering, let's say, what chivalry means, what you could do is you could just draw a little sketch, if you look up the word, of a knight bowing down before a damsel, or what have you, and that will help you remember that that chivalry in this context, means that, versus it means being moral in another context. And what you can also do is you annotate is to just imagine you're having a conversation with the text, and that can help you when it comes time for revisions to better remember what it was that you were working on. The other thing that we recommend, and I know we've discussed this too, is we know it's old-fashioned, but making a study sheet by hand. So even if there's a lot of information, there have been countless studies that have shown how much better students retain information when they're actually writing it down versus just typing it. And what we find, a trap that many students get into, is one of their friends will create a study sheet online and they'll look at it and they'll read it over and they'll say, yes, I've studied. So that kind of studying, it's possible that they've studied, but they haven't necessarily been active in their studying. And it's often just too passive to do so, because much of the studying is actually in the creation of the study sheet itself, not just in looking it over. So we recommend using a cumulative approach, again, building on stages upon one another, writing down the important information regardless of the subject in preparation for an assessment, excuse me, and then using a series of bullet points. And what I think can be really helpful that we recommend for all of our students is sub-vocalizing as they write, so kind of saying it as they write it. So the combination of saying it, writing it by hand, doing it in stages, and then revising and looking through all of it will help to cement the concepts in your memory. Another strategy that can be helpful is creating flashcards. And I think this can be especially helpful when you're learning foreign languages, or if you're trying to remember terminology in science or in math that's difficult to remember. So you can write down, a term on one side and the definition on the other, and you can, as Brian was alluding to before, create two different stacks of information that I still need to learn and information that I've mastered. And the idea is that you can physically see the pile that you've mastered get much larger in proportion to what you're still working on. And again, in the flashcards, if you're trying to jot down information about the accomplishments of a particular political figure, let's say, you always want to do it in bullet points, and you can write down like Vespucci's accomplishments, and then on the other side write down 3 bullet points and try to remember as you look at it, what were his 3 accomplishments? That's right. And then if you have trouble remembering them, using those mnemonics. The other thing that I really recommend, especially given the insanity of the past year and how much sedentary time all students and adults have had, is to get moving as you're studying. So a lot of movement. So what I think can be really helpful is actually kind of pacing around as you're reading things to yourself. This doesn't work for all kids, but I found especially when students have ADD or ADHD or really or none of the above, it can be really helpful just to move around while you're trying to recite the information, or as your parents or friends are quizzing you on it, because actually, rather than being a distraction, it can really help students to better focus and be centered and help them to better retain the information. And again, it's just mixing it up a little bit.
Abby, as we begin to transition from the speaking part of the evening to questions from the moderator and then the group, I think a lot of what you're saying correlates really well with the one question we received about how to revise for math, because in some way maths is not like science, as the question asks, where it's not like you have a piece of information that you're memorizing and then you're moving forward. But I think that speaks to exactly what you were saying, Abby, in terms of the differences between passive and active learning, where especially in mathematics, where so much of the work is going to be generated by the student who's sitting there taking the test. The way to revise for math specifically, but all of these courses across the board, tends to be to do the work as opposed to read through or look at the work. So the more problems, the more sample problems the student's able to do, especially if there's an answer key or somebody who can go through the material afterwards and see where there are errors and, versus where students have the material learned, doing the questions, not reading through the questions, but doing the questions and then seeing where you get caught up and where's a little bit more difficult, where you tend to go wrong, and then doing, a dozen of those types of questions until that transition from the frustrating moment where you forget to divide by a negative number on both sides, to the, oh, of course, that's one in a list of items that I've learned to do. It becomes actively engaging in your own work, in your own strengths and areas for improvement, and then redoing the questions themselves so no surprises come on the test themselves. But over to moderator questions. Thanks so much for having them for us.
Thank you guys. I love how extremely practical and helpful all of those tips are. And yeah, if any of you parents or students out there try out any of these, email us because we'd love to hear how you get on with them. So now just a couple of questions from me, and then we'll go back to the floor to take all of your guys' questions. So do enter as many questions as you like into the Q&A at the bottom here. So just a first question from me. I was really interested, sorry if you hear, we're just currently having monsoon season in North London right now, so it might get a bit loud. But so my question is, I was really interested by what you guys said to me before about how the US system every year is actually very similar to how the UK education system has transitioned for this year with teacher assessments and with the cancellation of exams for because of COVID. So obviously you guys still have exams as well, but so with teacher assessments, kids' grades are being awarded more on a kind of portfolio basis. And if they have in-school exams grades, then those get used as well. And I just wondered, on that note, do you have any advice for helping students keep up their stamina all the way across term? Because normally there's a kind of build up and it's all in exams in 2 weeks, whereas now they're having to really keep their standards as high as they can all term. And I wonder if you have any advice for dealing with that.
I think that's an excellent question. The most important thing is, I think, sort of goes back to the theme that we've been discussing with compartmentalizing and breaking all of the work that can feel overwhelming into manageable chunks. And that includes building in breaks. There have to be moments where you can take a walk or call a friend or do something that you genuinely enjoy that's totally separate from the academic world and the revision that you're doing. And I think that being able to see, again, mapping out a schedule and being able to see that you have a break coming up can be really helpful for maintaining your stamina, because otherwise it's going to feel kind of like drudgery. So if you are able to back plan and build in those moments where you're able to sit and eat dinner with your family and not have to, do so with your laptop in front of you or what have you, I think that that's really key, because otherwise you'll just be burnt out, and that won't be helpful for your mental health or for your academic marks.
Yeah, and Brian, you're currently teaching in a high school. Is it high school or a junior school?
Yeah, I'm currently teaching 14-year-olds and 18-year-olds.
Great. And do you have any kind of practical tips that you use with your students?
Absolutely. I think it's incredibly important to see the model that perhaps this year you folks are shifting to a little bit more as an opportunity and less as an additional, pressurized environment moving forward, where in this newer system, you're able to have every evening or every week work that really does matter. And it can be liberating to know that it's not just those end results that are going to determine so much, but it's, if you're willing to put in the work, you can put yourself in a position where not only are you better prepared for those final examinations, but those final examinations don't carry the same weight. And it can be emotionally far less stressful and less taxing if it's not like a build up to those final moments where everything feels like there's so much weight on them and it matters so much. If you've already banked, some good grades along the lines, and that the teacher knows your quality of work, and you've written a bunch of essays or done lab reports or gotten good scores on exams, it means that you don't need to face those final, whether they're A levels or whatever they're called this year, with that same degree of anxiety. So I think that, as Abby said, building in breaks, scheduling as far in advance as possible, and changing one's attitude from seeing these as just many, many, many more super anxiety-ridden events, as opposed to seeing it like that, see it as that one truly terrifying event, which gets a little bit less terrifying because it's spread out over the course of months.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly helpful for any students at the moment with these teacher assessments. My other question is kind of following the pandemic, a lot of kids were, basically everyone was kind of stuck at home the last year, and a lot of teens have found it hard to kind of get the confidence and the motivation to face both, to kind of fill in learning gaps that they might have developed over the last year, and then to kind of face these new challenges in school again. And I just wondered, from your guys working with young people, what kind of tactics do you have for helping teens grow both their confidence and their motivation?
Well, I think one of the important places to begin is with the sense that it really isn't the teen's responsibility at this moment. I know it feels like it is, and I know that a lot of you listening are going to say, no, it is, we don't have the structure, it's all on me, and there's so much pressure. And I'm not discounting that pressure at all, because that pressure is real. But you have to realize that across the UK, Europe, and the United States, what school administrators and education thinkers and teachers are doing, and what they're really devoting their summers to, and this is across the world, but especially in the UK and the United States right now, is trying to figure out what this transition back into more traditional learning looks like. Because for some students, it's going to be that they're a year behind on mathematics where they normally would be at this point. And it's going to be academic and how to get that rigorous pedagogy back. But for other students, it's just going to be socializing, like how to be in a room with a whole bunch of peers for the first time in a long time, or psychologically what it means to leave the house after being around your parents and siblings nonstop. And what's fascinating about that question, it's a wonderful one, is the anxieties are going to come from different places in each different student. So many of us are going to feel that same sense of anxiety, but it's going to be from different origins. And it's important to realize that it is the teacher's job, it's the school job, it's the institution's job to put you in a place where they're going to assess what learning loss has occurred, where you're beginning the year, and adjust curricula accordingly, where we can recommend everything that you'd imagine. You know, it's good to do as much reading as you can as possible. It doesn't matter what the reading's about, but keeping your mind engaged, keeping your vocabulary and your comprehension, your inferencing skills, reacting to those readings with, you know, written summaries or responses. There are basic ways to keep skills and stamina in that way going, but so much of what's going to happen come September, end of August, is the institutions themselves are going to reevaluate the role that they play, and there's going to be diagnostic work this year in a way that there haven't been in the past. Abby?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important to keep in mind. And in addition, as students, although the responsibility does fall to the school, it's important that as students you advocate for yourself, and as parents that you encourage your children to do so. So one of the things that's been so challenging across the globe is that teachers have had less of a sense than ever about what it is that their students do not understand, because when they have masks or it's via Zoom, it's very different than teaching in a classroom, a regular pre-COVID classroom where it's easy to read body language or where kids can more easily raise their hands, and it's just sort of a more natural environment. So teachers are dying for your feedback as students in terms of what doesn't make sense, or where you have questions, or what you find exciting, because again, they feel more distance from students than ever. And that's really how you can best help yourself. So we really encourage you to even set a goal of asking, let's say having 3 questions per day, or 3 comments per day, or whatever sort of mini goals you want to set for yourself to enter into that class discussion, and really encourage you to be candid about what doesn't make sense. Or if you say next year you're learning something, you'll really be helping your teachers and your classmates if you say, gosh, we really, our previous teacher really didn't touch upon that topic. I know normally we would have studied it, but I don't think we learned that. Or could you please repeat that? Because I guarantee you, your classmates will feel the same way, and you'll be doing yourself a huge service. And your teachers will be so delighted to know what those gaps are, rather than having, perhaps giving an assessment on a particular unit of material, and only then after the assessment finding out, oh gosh, this is really an area that needs attention. So you can be a tremendous asset to your teachers and to yourself in furthering your education, both this year and in the future.
And Abby, what's fascinating is a lot of what you just said answers a question that we received a minute ago about any tips to keep students motivated, right? Some of the same skills that you're talking about asking questions, feeling as though you're a participant in the education as opposed to somebody who's just receiving the education. Similarly, like nobody's motivated right now. We've just been through 16 months of hell. And, for some people it means illness or losing family members. For other people, it means unemployment or coping, with very serious life circumstances changes. So to be motivated to go do your maths homework is a lot to ask. So I think instead of thinking about it in terms of how to keep motivated in that same sense of excitement or, you know, joy in learning that we've seen in the past, it's how to stay engaged, right? It's how to choose the aspects of your academic life that are stimulating, that get you excited to participate in, and also extracurricular work, especially now that it's getting nicer outside and we can do work or we can do more activities that make us feel good about ourselves instead of as parents. I mean, we all as parents fall into this trap, especially as parents who are teachers, this idea that if you're not, you know, getting a good marks in history, there's a disaster. Like right now, if as parents you can focus on athletic successes or artistic successes or just anything, cooking or whatever engages your child right now, that will lead to confidence and academic success in a way that just focusing on academics all the time and making students feel like they have less confidence in that realm can be detrimental.
This is so helpful. Thank you, guys. I think now that we're in the last 6 minutes, we can move to some more questions from our audience. Let's see.
So one of the questions, if that's okay,
please do, yeah.
Great, if I take it. So there was a question about a child who finds maths a struggle and forgets about topics she's learned in school months later, which is something we see all the time, especially in math, because it really is so cumulative. So if you forget how to, you know, make a mixed number an improper fraction, and then you're dealing with, you know, finding the circumference and volume of a cylinder, you'll be completely lost because you won't have remembered what you learned several years back. So I imagine there's a number of great programs in the UK as well, but IXL can be really wonderful. It is IXL.com. It goes through all different math topics from, you know, from age 5 through age 18 plus. And it really, you can hone in on specific topics. So for example, if you're struggling with, you know, finding the value of X or isolating variables, they'll give you something on that, and then it builds up progressively. So you can either sort of revise a whole section or topic, or you can hone in on more specific parts, and you can do as many questions as you'd like. And also it's great for students to do, because what happens is if you get an answer incorrect, the program will give you a similar kind of, it'll give you first an explanation and overview that students can read through it, and then it will give you a similar kind of question. So once you've mastered it, it will then progress you further along in the topic, but it really is attuned to each student's individual learning benchmarks, and parents can also just log in easily and see what it is that their students are doing wonderfully in or may have challenges with as well.
Awesome, thank you. And then, so we have another question here from Laura, and this is one as a disorganized teen I can identify with. So how do you get around helping a student who hates being organized?
Slowly. The problem that a lot of parents come to with students who dislike being organized, which are, you know, 95% of teenagers dislike being organized, is they come at their students, at their sons or daughters, with that third slide I had, with like, your homework preparation should look like this, you know, and it's like, what do you, you know, because it's combining a million different elements that they're not thinking of, that feel overwhelming or intimidating, that they're not accustomed to. Whereas if students really don't like being organized, suggest 1 or 2 ways to approach them and give them that advice and say, for today, let's try to talk through what you have for tomorrow and do the most difficult task first, right? And that in and of itself becomes an accomplishment on the way to organization. Or if it's just back planning, right? You don't need to talk about it in terms of organization and structuring your whole life and you're bad at this and let's make you better at this. Let's just say, remember how you struggled on that last, you know, writing response. This is a way on this next one to try to simplify it a little bit. I feel like as parents, I know that I do this all the time. I see the big picture and I get intimidated by it. You know, I say like, my kid's not good at this, or my kid doesn't like this, or how am I going to help my son do this? Whereas really just like getting in the weeds and saying, this is one tip that we can start incorporating into our academic lives. That's the way to help somebody out who just hates the idea of organization. Because throwing an entire system at a teenager, you're going to be rebuffed, right? That's going to lead to a frustrated both of you, as opposed to a more organized student.
Yeah, and I think, and I know we've said this a lot, what students will see is that in following a system, and if you recommend just trying something once, something very small, like start with the hardest assignment first. That's like the number one most important tip. We can't overemphasize it enough for kids and for adults too. They'll see that it's actually much less stressful. And then the idea is that they'll want to do that on their own. I know with my own children, I've seen that where I've said that, they haven't wanted to do, one of my sons really is not a fan of math in general. And I said, okay, just this once, let's do the math first. And then, you can do what follows and you don't have to do it again if you don't want to. And he actually was like, oh my gosh, it's so much better because now I can look forward to the rest of the evening and it's out of the way. So the idea is that in implementing these systems, hopefully students will see the value in them if you do little by little.
Yeah, just like incremental change sounds like that sounds like what you both said. Cool. I think so. We're in the kind of just the last minute now, and there's one quite important question, which I think a problem which I think a lot of families are struggling with, where kind of what do you do? I'm really interested in kind of what you've experienced as both tutors and teachers, and perhaps as parents as well. What do you do in the situation where if a student's grades have just plummeted and they're going down, they feel if there's been a real kind of backwards progress, and they're feeling low confident and like unable, they feel, oh, what's the point? I'm going to fail now anyway, as Diana has said to us. What do you do in these kind of crisis situations?
So you try to disconnect the examination from the goal a little bit, because if some students feel, what's the purpose of any of this? I'm not going to get into the uni I want, or what's the purpose of any of this? I'm going to fail anyway. It can feel overwhelming to the point that you just want to give up and not do it anymore. But if you connect it more to the purpose of this is to do the best you can now and then build off of it, or the purpose of this is to show yourself and me that after this long year and a half where literally human beings died and other people lost their jobs, like this is, if you're feeling bad right now, like that's reasonable. Maybe that what your goals were before all of this, we do have to recalibrate a little bit or take some time and try again or whatever it is. But throwing your hands up and saying it's all over, so I'm not going to try, is going to create more problems down the road. Whereas detaching the studying, the revising that you're doing now from that initial goal and connecting it more to what the type of person you want to be is, or what that next goal might be, or setting yourself up for success down the road, that will put you in a position to create at least a little bit more motivation and less of a sense of, woe is me, I might as well give up because what's the point?
The other thing that I think is helpful is to reach out if there's a teacher in school that your child especially likes or has a connection with, or a guidance counselor, is to reach out to them and tell them that your child is struggling, and see if perhaps they can do something to buoy your child's spirits a bit and make them feel a little more confident, and then perhaps suggest to them, let's look at a plan together, because sometimes it's the hardest when parents are the ones trying to do it, and when the school is involved, it's a much easier kind of partnership for the child, and it feels less sort of antagonistic. And it may just be, part of it is I think as parents just recalibrating and knowing maybe your child won't enjoy homework this year, and that's okay, but to help her feel better about herself, I think working on the confidence building and what she does enjoy, whichever subjects those may be, really building from there and starting small again, and speaking with someone at the school.
Yeah, and like, is it about, do you mean, Brian, in terms of thinking about getting a university place or not, or like becoming a doctor or not, just kind of taking all the way back to like, how can I just get this piece of homework done? Is that what you meant?
Absolutely. I think that so many students see where they are right now as not where they hoped to be right now because of how difficult this year is. And they then look around and say, what's the point of moving forward? Like, what's the point of even trying? And many students will be positively surprised by the leeway, the slack that they are given about this year, right? That if it feels like I'm a failure this year, what's the point of trying? Students really should be reminded by the adults in their life that this year was hard. It was difficult for all of us. And just focusing on the small item that you can control and not necessarily the larger narrative that you've been building up to all this time will eventually put you in a position to succeed, perhaps as you imagined in the past, or perhaps in a new way moving forward.
Yeah, it's just definitely a year for everyone to be forgiving of everyone, isn't it? Both
Exactly
adults
right.
As well, yes.
Like, let's all just be kind to ourselves.
Exactly.
Well, thank you. I think we'll clear it up there because we're just a few minutes over now. But just thank you so much, Brian and Abby, for your incredibly helpful advice, tips, expertise that you've shared with us this evening. Everyone who's here, I will, someone asked, I will share all of the links which have been posted in the chat, and any other resources which were mentioned in our email to everyone tomorrow. And I'll of course link again to Brian and Abby's book as well, where you can find all of these pieces of advice written down. And then we'll also have the recording so you can keep watching or share with any other parents or kids who you think would find it helpful. So yeah, just thank you so much, everyone. And have a good evening or have a good day.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. It was
Such
a real
pleasure.
treat. Wonderful questions as well. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Do well.
Thank you guys. Bye.
Thanks for having